Hello, World History classes. Today we're going to go through our section on 21.2 that had a worksheet that you were assigned yesterday. Hopefully you got that worksheet out so you can make corrections or changes or fill things in if you missed it. So whenever you need to, you can stop this and go back and make sure you've got everything where it needs to be and you have all the right answers going forward. So we're looking at the scramble for Africa, it was dubbed, or the 19th century colonization of Africa. Now, we're going to move through this pretty quickly, considering we got to get this in by 15 minutes. So let's start off. Why Africa? Why now? Well, in short, Africa had been a center for the slave trade up until the early 1800s when the slave trade was coming to a halt. And, during that time, European people did not usually go to inland Africa. In most cases, they tended to stay on the shores, on the coasts, where slaves were usually brought to them as prisoners of war. Now, as industrialization picked up and the need for raw materials by European countries peaked, Africa seemed like an easy target. And things like rubber, palm oil, textiles, we'll get to gold and diamonds too as well, made it very appealing and close by. Now, on top of this, during this time period, you start seeing new innovations in medicine and vaccines, inoculations, or primarily inoculations for malaria with quinine that allowed for Europeans to actually travel into Central Africa without fearing disease. So, this combination of industry with new medicine and technology created a situation where Africa, in the eyes of Europeans, was ripe for the taking. Now, in some regions of Africa, in particular Egypt, uh, you saw some of the natives exert a little bit more control. Now, Egypt for years had been part of the Ottoman Empire until 1805, and eventually, when Muhammad Ali seized the government and the control of that area, and began to make some pretty drastic changes to kind of move Egypt forward. Where you're looking at a time period where most colonies and most of these African states were behind the game and couldn't develop this stuff. The Muhammad Ali puts in a modern army. He puts in public schools. He builds industries, sugar industries, munitions, textiles, the use of Egyptian cotton. Egyptian cotton was sought over throughout the world for the amount of thread count that it had and the comfort. So it was a luxury item that was produced. On top of that as well, Egypt was also a center, a geographic center, because with steamships and faster boats, Europeans had developed some new technology to create canals, which was happening in other parts of Europe. Uh, and it just seemed ideal that they would create a canal somewhere to connect the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. And eventually, under French supervision and Egyptian labor, construction in 1884 for a canal between the Med and the Red began. And it was completed 15 years after. And originally, the French had a little piece of this, but the British are the Europeans that eventually gain the most control. They buy their way in. Once they buy the Egyptian rights or Egyptian stocks in this and the shareholdings, they start seeing some revolts from Egyptians in 1888, put that down, and then eventually they kind of take Egypt in as a protectorate. The Egyptians get to rule the government, but the British oversee it and protect it by 1914. Later on, after some setbacks, they eventually take the Sudan just to the south of Egypt as well, controlling that region. But you can see, I mean, you're cutting almost 5,000 miles off of your trip around Africa by taking those. Now, other countries that got involved, we'll talk about Germany later, but France and Italy. Italy, early on, failed to take a colony, when they tried to seize Ethiopia. The Ethiopians scored a huge victory over them, embarrassed the Italians, but eventually the Italians do get a hold of some land in Africa. Primarily, the first place they take is Turkish Tripoli right up here, which will eventually be renamed Libya in 1911. The French focused more on the north west, where they had tons of colonists moving in there, 150,000 by 1880, primarily into the Algerian region in 1879. They eventually take Tunisia in 1881, and then eventually Morocco in 1912. All of these areas eventually become controlled by the French. Right around this time, too, you do start seeing some exploration into Central Africa. In the case of the story of David Livingstone and Henry Stanley Morton, or Henry Morton Stanley, uh, Livingstone was this missionary explorer that had been through Africa for 30 years. He was trying to bring trade. He was trying to find the source of the Nile. He wanted to Christianize most of Africa, and then he also wanted to bring Western civilization, as many of the imperialists of this time wanted to do as well. Uh, there was a period where he actually went missing for 4 years, and it became this big spectacle that the British weren't too concerned about it, but the U.S. media made a big deal out of it and led this huge expedition led by this former Civil War vet from the South, a Confederate, Henry Morton Stanley, who led a search party. And they went through hell. He almost died. He contemplated taking his own life. He had malaria, lost men. But after 8 months, they eventually stumble across Livingston living amongst a tribe perfectly fine. And after everything that Stanley had been through, he was shocked to find him. And his famous lines to this day are, "Dr. Livingston, I presume," when he arrived and found him. Now, interesting thing about this is, a couple years later in 1873, Livingston dies, and Stanley kind of takes over for him in Africa, despite the fact that he could not stand the country. He could not stand the region. He tried to encourage the British to actually colonize most of the Congo, but the British refused and weren't interested at that time. But he did find a taker in King Leopold II of Belgium, who would later come in. So you see, just a quick look at Livingston on the left, Stanley, as you kind of see, is the soldier on the right, and the kind of recreation of their interaction at this village when they found him down here on the bottom. Now, getting back to King Leopold of Belgium, he comes in with this idea that he's going to take the Congo and turn it into this progressive place, bring democracy, bring good things to the Congo. But if you still watch the Mankind clip, he's in there to make money off of rubber, ivory, raw materials, and he makes over $1 billion over a period of like 15, 20 years, if I remember correctly. But he did it at the cost of human life. During this time period, to force his workers to meet their quotas, he would enforce murder and, in many cases, mutilations, cutting off hands and feet of children that did not meet quotas, and to set an example. And it took years, but eventually some missionaries stumbled across this and took pictures that you can see here on the right that kind of that did expose this, and eventually it forced King Leopold to relinquish his control in the early 1900s, but not without cost. Like I said, almost 10 million, by most estimates, were massacred under Leopold's forced labor system in the Congo. Just an example for the devaluation of African life by imperialists. Now, another thing that happened here involved Germany. Now, Germany, it was led by a guy named Otto von Bismarck, who originally didn't want to colonize, but he knew to compete he had to. And they started to compete for colonies in the east and western portions of Africa. And eventually the British got in their way a little bit, and so did the Portuguese. Bismarck did not want to get into a big war about this. Did the logical thing, called for a meeting of all these countries to figure out how to divide up all this land in Africa. And they called this meeting the Berlin Conference. Interestingly enough, no Africans were invited. But this meeting set the precedent for how they were going to split up these colonies that we'll look up later on. But it was a big turning point and kind of the organized occupation of Africa. Now, in South Africa, this was the area where most of the Europeans actually moved. Now, there had been Europeans in the 17th century there known as the Boers that were Dutch descendants, and they were also known as the Afrikaners as well. And eventually the British began to move into this area and controlled it later on in the early 1800s. And the Boers and Afrikaners did not want anything to do with British rule. They liked their ideas of white supremacy. Uh, had a history of segregating natives, things like that, and they wanted to live their own way. So they eventually moved just slightly to the north and established two new established settlements for them. That put them in conflict with some locals, and particularly the Zulus. But they stayed there for a period of time until later coming into conflict with another British man named Cecil Rhodes. Now, Cecil Rhodes came into South Africa and he made an absolute killing and a fortune in diamonds and gold. His mining fields, with De Beers mining, became essentially like a monopoly in the jewelry industry. Made lots of money. And Rhodes had bigger plans, though. He wanted to be able to link South Africa and make everything from South Africa all the way up the Nile into the Egyptian lands that were controlled by the British. He wanted it all to be British. And he did some pretty shady stuff as far as trying to accomplish this goal by trying to create an uprising within the Boers regions that they had just moved to. This backfired and led to a British war with the Boers that was called the Boer War between 1899 and 1902. Pretty costly war, guerrilla tactics, British prison children. There's a lot of stuff that went down, and about 20,000 people were killed in this war that ultimately went down to the British. But this also helped create what we now think of South Africa, that combined the Afrikaners or Dutch settlers' lands with the British lands, but at the same time kept in the policies of the Afrikaners with the racial discrimination that lasted all the way into the 1990s. It was kind of the formation of apartheid, which was designed segregation. That if you've paid attention in world history, or you will learn about him, a guy named Nelson Mandela opposed, and eventually his movement won out later on. Now, in most cases, when we talk about imperial rule, the British were one of the rare ones that used indirect rule and allowed locals, indigenous people, usually the wealthy people that were loyal to the empire, run things. Most of the other colonies used direct rule, where they had someone put in place and they tried to assimilate the cultures of the people while maintaining their traditions. So that was a clear difference between the British and how others did things. But one thing, even though the fact that some of these groups favored the elite Africans, the wealthy Africans, there was a clear gap that emerged. The fact that the Europeans were still extremely discriminatory and condescending to African society. Even the wealthy Africans began to question the allegiance, even though they didn't suffer like some of the other poorer groups. And later on, it eventually leads to the independent movements that we'll see in the early 20th century in Africa. So in short, this was a map I gave you yesterday to kind of give you an idea. You really see what takes place between 1880 and 1913, where this entire continent is consumed by European countries, only leaving Liberia and Ethiopia as the only independent nations. All right, that's it for today. Thank you.